Welcome to the letter that never arrived, sealed in a tin box buried deep beneath a creek that no longer flows. The paper is watermarked, the ink almost vanished, yet one name keeps bleeding through E.M. Carter. No record shows such a man among the living or the dead. But the handwriting, steady, deliberate, unbroken, survived the fire, the flood, and the silence of 60 winters. The envelope was found by accident wedged between stones under Laurel Creek's collapsed bridge, wrapped in a strip of blue uniform cloth that hadn't rotted. The wax seal still clung to the fold. Inside one page, never folded twice. The words began mid-sentence as if the writer knew time was running out. If I don't return before the thaw. And then nothing. No date. No signature. Only the faint trace of a thumbprint blackened pressed hard into the margin. December 1864, Laurel Creek, Georgia, fog rising from burned fields, the crackle of frozen timber, the echo of distant rifles that no one answers anymore. The 7th Infantry had pulled back 2 days earlier, leaving behind half their supply train and every unsent letter meant for home. Couriers were cut off. The telegraph line was gone. By the time the next unit arrived, snow had sealed the valley. They found only mules' crates and an open satchel of mail scattered across the frozen creek bed. Every letter was addressed, stamped, and numbered except this one. No one knew who carried it. No regiment seal, no officer's mark, just that recurring name, E.M. Carter. When the recovery crew turned the satchel over, they swore the water beneath it was warm, as if something had just been pulled from fire. The corporal who logged the find noted, "The page emitted a faint heat when exposed to air, possibly from decay." The entry was later crossed out in black ink. What makes this single letter different isn't the paper. It's the handwriting that appears in other archives miles apart on documents signed years before and years after 1864. Requisitions, burial reports, even a ledger entry from 1871 listing rations for E.M. Carter deceased. Every stroke of that looping L matched the letter found under the bridge. Handwriting analysts called it identical impossible. Yet the evidence sat in front of them, refusing to fade. Locals still say the creek sometimes turns the color of rust after heavy rain, like ink seeping through water. Some nights when the moon drops behind the ridge, they claim to see a faint glow near the old bridge, as if something beneath were reflecting candlelight from below. The county archives received anonymous submissions photographs, showing a faint outline of a folded page against stone, though divers sent to investigate found nothing. Just current and darkness. If you're hearing this now, look down at the timestamp, pause right here. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from, and the exact second you stopped when you first heard the name Laurel Creek. What do you think it means for a letter to keep traveling long after its sender is gone, because this story isn't about who wrote it. It's about why it never stopped moving. And as we follow the trail from one forgotten archive to another, from battlefield to creek bed to courthouse shelf, you'll see how a single page outlasted every name carved in stone. How it crossed decades without postage, without a messenger, carried only by rumor, flood, and memory. The soldiers are gone. The war is over. But the letter's still on its way home. December 1864. Northern Georgia, the air thick with ash and sleet. The smell of wet gunpowder still hangs over Laurel Creek, though the cannon fire has long gone silent. The ground trembles not from war, but from thawing earth, each step sinking into what was once a road and is now a graveyard of wheels, crates, and shattered boots. The town itself, if it can still be called that, is nothing more than chimneys standing without houses. Fences split like bones, and fields where wheat once grew, now littered with rusted belt buckles. Somewhere among them, a company clerk had set up a makeshift desk on the tailgate of a wagon. One hand ink-stained, the other trembling from cold, recording names of the fallen on half-burned ledgers. His pen stops mid-line when he sees a piece of folded parchment in the mud. He picks it up. Not the first letter he's found, but this one feels heavier, as if something unseen clings to it. The wax seal hasn't cracked even though it's soaked. It's not government issue, no regimental stamp, no supply request. Just a faint looping name written twice across the back, E.M. Carter. He slides it into a tin ration box to dry, makes a note in the margin of his ledger, letter recovered from creek. No addressee. Later, when the box reaches the quartermaster's tent, someone else crosses out the entry entirely. For weeks, Laurel Creek is swallowed by retreat. The 7th Infantry drags its wounded south through the fog, abandoning wagons too heavy to pull. Locals watch from door frames that no longer have doors. They see men with no flags, uniforms turned gray from soot faces, hollow from fever. And in the confusion, some letters are burned for warmth, others buried to hide evidence of supply shortages, and a few are simply lost, dropped into the creek, where ice forms thin glass over unread words. By January, the mail train carrying field correspondence is ambushed 12 miles east of the ridge. When survivors recount what they saw, one detail keeps returning. The mailbags scattered across the snow, torn open paper, flying like feathers. But among them, one envelope was sealed in tin. A Union private describes seeing a small metal case still warm to the touch, though the day was below freezing. His statement is filed, then lost, then rediscovered decades later among pension records in Washington. The handwriting that recorded his testimony bears a signature nearly identical to the one on the envelope, E.M. Carter. There's no official record of such a soldier in Confederate or Union rolls. The name appears only in fragments, hospital logs. Quartermaster manifests a burial order in Savannah listing Carter E.M., unknown origin. The handwriting in all of them is the same steady line tilted slightly left, confident calm out of place among the desperate scrawl of men riding on horseback or by candlelight. By 1870, when the region begins rebuilding, the creek has already buried most of its evidence. Locals find brass buttons with initials melted flat cartridge boxes sealed in mud. The bridge collapses during a flood that spring, cutting off the northern road. Underneath its ruins, children playing with glass bottles claim to see something shining, a metal lid, smooth as silver. One of them, a girl named Lydia Hall, later recalls to a county archivist in 1932, "We thought it was a mirror, but it had words on it. We couldn't read them then." I still remember the letters EMC. She was 79 when she said it. Laurel Creek never fully recovers. The war ends, the fields are replanted, but no one rebuilds the bridge. The creek changes course, swallowing part of the old wagon road and carving a deep basin that fills with fog every winter. Hunters say the ground there feels soft, like something beneath keeps shifting. During the 1890s, a railway surveyor marks the site for a new line and notes in his report, subsurface anomaly near Old Bridge Hollow Resonance, possible buried structure. The company never follows up. In 1927, during a drought, the waterline drops low enough for locals to walk along the exposed creek bed. They find rusted munitions, belt plates, a child's toy, and something else, a small square tin box with a folded paper still inside. The seal remains intact. The words are faint, but visible ink faded to sepia. The handwriting matches the old military archives. Same tilt, same looping L. The county clerk logs it as artifact of unknown origin, then locks it in the courthouse vault. When archivists reopen the box in 1962, the letter is gone. Only the imprint remains, like a fossil pressed into metal. No one knows how many times it has surfaced, since once in a private collection, once in an estate sale, again in a museum request. Each time someone swears it's the same letter, same name, same incomplete sentence. The line always ends the same way: "If I don't return before the thaw," followed by blankness. The paper itself seems to change hands without origin or destination, a message forever suspended between sender and receiver. And maybe that's why people keep searching. Because a letter that never reaches home carries more weight than one that does. It's not just ink on paper, it's proof of a moment that refused to end. For the families of men who never returned a missing letter is both a wound and a promise. They imagine it somewhere out there, still traveling, still trying to deliver the words that might have made the loss make sense. Laurel Creek became a quiet place after the war, but the story of the letter never left. Children were told not to play near the old bridge after dark, not because of ghosts, but because the ground itself was said to whisper when you stepped too close to the water. Some said it was air moving through cracks. Others swore they heard words, just one repeated softly, like breath: home, home, home. And so the legend of the soldier began, not the battles he fought, not the army he served, but the letter he wrote and never sent. It would resurface each generation in a different form, a folded page, a rumor, a name in a ledger, always returning, always incomplete. This is where our story begins, not in the war itself, but in the silence that followed it. A silence that somehow still speaks. A silence that carries ink. A silence named E.M. Carter. The story of the letters begins in the summer of 1861, before the war had even learned its own cruelty. A young officer in the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers sat in his tent near Washington, writing to his wife. He tried to explain what duty felt like, how love and country pulled in opposite directions until the heart tore somewhere in between. When he folded the paper, he hesitated. There was no seal, no address written yet. He meant to finish it after the coming battle, when the noise quieted, when he could tell her he was safe. The next week, his regiment marched to Bull Run. His name was Major Sullivan Ballou, and his letter was found months later in the burned remains of his trunk. The paper had browned, the ink had bled, but the words still carried the tremor of his hand. It became one of the first voices of a nation learning how to say goodbye. By the middle years of the war, the practice of leaving words behind had become almost ritual. Soldiers folded messages into cartridge boxes or tucked them inside the lining of their coats. They wrote by the light of campfires that never quite warmed them, scratching quick sentences before the ink froze. Most never expected delivery. They wrote to hold on, to prove, if only to themselves, that someone far away still waited. The letters that survived carry the weight of that waiting. They begin with talk of weather, end with small instructions: feed the horses, mend the fence, kiss the child. Between those domestic fragments lies the quiet realization that these may be the last lines they ever write. In June 1864, on the fields of Cold Harbor, Virginia, thousands of men spent one final night with pen and paper. Dawn would bring a charge everyone knew was hopeless. The chaplain who walked the lines later said the air itself seemed full of whispering graphite. They wrote on knapsacks, on scraps of envelopes, on the backs of old orders, anything that would take a mark. In the morning, many tucked their letters under the straps of their jackets, sealing them with candle grease. When the guns stopped, the field was littered with pages. Rain fell and turned the ink to pale veins, but enough words remained to tell what they had hoped for: home, a thaw, a promise to see spring again. The letters collected there were never delivered. They were tagged, numbered, and stored in military depots, the handwriting pressed flat between reports of losses and supply tallies. Some still bear the stains of mud that will never dry. Farther south in Georgia, another archive of silence grew behind the walls of Andersonville Prison. Thousands of Union captives, starving and fevered, tried to write home with whatever they could find. Charcoal pencil stubs, scraps of packing paper. They wrote knowing the guards would confiscate their words at the gate. They wrote anyway. When federal forces liberated the camp in 1865, they found boxes of unsent letters buried under the barracks floor. Most were unsigned, some addressed only to Mother or my dear ones. Many of the writers had died weeks before. In the years that followed, clerks and nurses tried to identify the senders, matching fragments of handwriting to names on death rolls. Few matched. Most remained filed as unknown, found with effects. After the fighting ended, the war's correspondence did not stop moving. In 1866, the U.S. Post Office Dead Letter Office reported millions of envelopes opened, inspected, and destroyed. Among them were bundles recovered from battlefields and hospitals, the paper still smelling of smoke. Clerks reading through them copied especially moving passages into ledgers before burning the originals. They wrote brief notes in the margins, ink-faded paper, damp returned sender deceased. Each line reduced a life to procedure, yet those clerks, in their own quiet way, preserved the intimacy of strangers. Decades later, those ledgers became some of the most human records of the war. Even long after Appomattox, the earth kept returning the voices it had swallowed. Farmers plowing near Richmond found bottles stuffed with folded sheets, the words still visible through glass. Construction crews digging foundations turned up small tins of paper sealed in wax. One bottle, discovered in 1999 and authenticated by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, contained 3 letters dated between 1864 and 1865. The handwriting trembled but endured. They spoke of waiting for the frost to lift, of faith in a reunion that never came. Time had buried them deeper than any grave yet. They traveled on, rescued, cataloged, placed in climate-controlled drawers where the air no longer moved, but the words still breathed. In every archive, the pattern repeats. Sentences stop mid-thought, as if interrupted by a command or an explosion. Dates blur. Some letters have fingerprints pressed into the ink. Others carry dried grass or threads of fabric trapped in the fold. Together, they form an accidental map of a country writing to itself. The men and women who touched these pages are gone, but their words describe the same motion, the desire to reach home, to bridge the impossible distance between the living and the waiting. There is nothing mythical in these papers. They are ink fiber dust. Their truth lies in their incompleteness. Each one is a beginning without an end, a story stopped in the act of returning. They tell us more about absence than presence, more about love than war. And though their writers no longer have names, the handwriting remains a kind of pulse, flattened by time but still legible. If you stand in one of the glass-walled archives today, Rhode Island, Washington, Andersonville, you can lean close and see the faint shimmer of graphite. You can almost imagine the hand that held the pen, the breath that paused before the next word. The letter never sent is still on its journey, moving not through distance but through years, crossing from the battlefield into our hands. It is real. Every stroke, every blot of ink, real enough to prove that even in the machinery of war, the smallest gesture a man writing home can outlive the noise that killed him. And that is the truth behind every legend of the letter that never returned. It did exist. It exists, still preserved not by myth, but by paper, by the stubborn endurance of ink that refuses to fade. These are the real letters, forever on their way home. Even after the war ended, the letters did not vanish. Families who had waited anxiously for news of their loved ones discovered envelopes months or even years later, tucked into trunks hidden in floorboards, or left in the attic of an abandoned home. In Rhode Island, the Ballou family preserved the letter Major Sullivan Ballou had written just days before he died at Bull Run. It remained folded in its original state, a tangible connection to a man who would never return. The paper was brittle edges, curling ink faded, yet the words retained the weight of a life cut short. Every generation that read the letter understood its meaning, the urgency and the quiet hope within its lines. It became both a personal memory and a historical artifact, bridging the gap between what was written and what was received. Similar occurrences were recorded throughout the South. In Georgia and Virginia, the surviving families of soldiers detained or killed during the war often received correspondence too late to change anything. These letters were cataloged in various repositories, such as the Andersonville prison records, or kept by families whose ancestors had survived. Letters that had once been intended to comfort or instruct arrived after the sender had already passed, making them documents not of delivery, but of endurance. They were physical proofs of intention, waiting for recognition, long after the writer was gone. The Federal Writers Project of the 1930s documented these experiences. Interviewers recorded accounts from children and grandchildren of soldiers, noting that many had received letters from fathers, uncles, or cousins only decades later, sometimes by mail forwarded from old post offices or discovered among other family effects. In every report, the emphasis was on the delay and the persistence of memory. The letters themselves survived fire, flood, and decay, and through them the stories of the men who wrote them persisted. The language used was factual, describing the process of discovery, the condition of the paper, and the contents, but it also revealed the emotional significance the letters held for their recipients. One archivist working with letters from Cold Harbor described handling envelopes that had been exposed to mud and rain, noting that the ink remained legible despite war exposure and time. Another noted that letters sent from Andersonville were often unsigned, incomplete, or written in pencil on scraps of paper, yet families still preserved them with care. These letters were cataloged, and in some cases reproduced in family memoirs, newspapers, or state archives, showing that even unsigned and undelivered correspondence held tremendous historical and emotional value. In Massachusetts, the Sullivan-Ballou letters were published, giving the broader public insight into the war's human dimension. In Virginia, letters discovered from soldiers of the 5th New York Heavy Artillery revealed the repeated phrase, "If the frost breaks before I do, I will be home for planting." It became evident to historians that many soldiers wrote with this sense of temporal uncertainty, acknowledging that their words might never reach home. The recurrence of such phrasing across multiple correspondences provided evidence of a widespread practice writing letters that, due to death, displacement, or loss, would be delivered late or not at all. These recovered letters were often handled with meticulous care. Archivists, historians, and family members alike noted the tactile experience of the letters, the texture of the paper, the indentation of the pencil or pen, the folds that remained from hurried handling. They described the ink as sometimes smudged, often faded, yet still telling the story of both sender and recipient. The letters themselves in these factual cases became a conduit for understanding the psychological and social impact of war. They were evidence of separation, anticipation, hope, and in many instances, mourning. No account claimed the letters moved themselves or appeared mysteriously. What was consistently recorded, however, was the extraordinary resilience of the material and the enduring significance of the messages. Families treasured them not because of supernatural qualities, but because they were the tangible remnants of lives that had intersected with national events. The letters carried emotional truth, factual evidence, and the imprint of the writer's hand, creating a bridge between past and present. The Federal Writers Project interviews repeatedly emphasized this point. Respondents spoke of letters found decades later in trunks or boxes, sometimes misfiled in government records, and later returned to descendants. In each case, the letters arrived after the events they described had passed, yet they were still capable of conveying a profound sense of connection. One widow recalled receiving a letter from her husband, who had died months earlier, reading it aloud to her children in 1870. Her account, recorded by interviewers, detailed the precise condition of the paper and the legibility of the ink, noting that she had kept it folded in the same envelope for years. In summary, these letters represent a real, verifiable folk layer of the Civil War. They are factual in that they exist, they were written, and they were received late or never at all. They are not myth. They are evidence of the human experience of war. They demonstrate that correspondence can survive the chaos of battle and the passage of time, preserving intentions, emotions, and memory. When the letters are finally read, the delay becomes part of the story, illustrating how the tangible traces of individual lives continue to resonate long after the war has ended. Through these letters from Ballou in Rhode Island, to Cold Harbor, to Andersonville, and countless other soldiers, the pattern is clear: words written with the hope of reaching home frequently did not arrive in time. Yet the survival of the letters themselves provides historians and descendants a direct link to the past. The factual record preserved in archives and collections across the United States confirms that while the letters could not prevent death or change outcomes, they were capable of conveying experience, intention, and emotional resonance across decades. These letters are still accessible today, digitized or preserved in controlled archives, offering insight into the practical realities of war, the bureaucratic processes of the military and postal system, and the deeply human act of writing in the face of uncertainty. Each letter that survived provides proof of the soldier's voice, and in that voice lies both historical fact and the enduring story of human connection under extraordinary circumstances. Even after the war formally ended, the letters that were never delivered continued to connect the scattered pieces of a nation trying to heal. Families held envelopes for years before they reached them. Soldiers' last messages, folded in cartridge boxes or tucked in their uniforms, often arrived months, even decades later, as post offices reopened and records were recovered. Across multiple battlefields, a clear pattern emerges. Letters were written in anticipation of the worst, rarely sent on time, but preserved through care, chance, and official record-keeping. In Petersburg and Cold Harbor, officers instructed clerks to gather all correspondence from men who would not return. These collections were cataloged carefully. When units retreated, some of the letters remained behind, stored in temporary depots. Many were later destroyed, but a number were forwarded to state archives or federal depositories. Even when misfiled, these letters eventually found their way back to families or researchers. The result is a network of communication that survived both war and bureaucracy, connecting soldiers with their loved ones long after the guns fell silent. One clear example comes from the Union soldiers of the 5th New York Heavy Artillery. Letters written at the front lines often referenced dates, places, and instructions for household tasks, while acknowledging the likelihood that the letter might never be delivered. The phrase, "if I do not return," recurs across multiple correspondences. Families who received these notes years later reported that the text had remained remarkably legible, ink darkened by age but not illegible. In these cases, the content served as both testimony of the sender's intent and a practical record for the recipient. Across the South, letters from Andersonville prisoners demonstrate a similar bridge between personal experience and historical record. Inmates documented their conditions on scraps of paper tucked in boxes, hidden under floorboards, or held in small containers. When Union forces liberated the prison, the surviving letters were collected and sorted, many of them being delivered decades later to the families of those who had perished. The act of preservation, deliberate or accidental, allowed the written words to outlast the chaos of war and the decay of the material environment. In many cases, the delayed delivery of these letters meant that the content was already historical by the time it reached the intended recipient. A mother might receive a note from her son months after his death, containing instructions for household chores or reassurances about family. These letters were factual, tangible, and verifiable, yet they carried an emotional resonance heightened by the delay. Archivists repeatedly note that the combination of legibility, timing, and context transforms these letters into artifacts that bridge personal memory with collective history. Some letters were routed through multiple post offices, passing from clerk to clerk, sometimes being returned to the sender's original unit before reaching the family. The U.S. Post Office Department Dead Letter Office maintained detailed records of letters returned for insufficient address or for deceased recipients. In 1866, the office reported over 4 million undeliverable items, many of which contained soldiers' correspondence. The chain of custody meticulously recorded provides a factual account of how these letters traversed the country, forming a network that linked battlefield to home through paper, ink, and human intent. Beyond individual letters, historians have documented clusters of correspondence that survived within specific units. The collections from the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers, 5th New York, Heavy Artillery, and the 7th Infantry reveal a striking consistency. Soldiers wrote letters they knew might never be delivered, folded them carefully, and entrusted them to officers or comrades. Some letters were kept for decades in archives, others rediscovered among estate papers. The recurring motif, letters delayed or lost, but preserved, connects multiple theaters of the war from northern states to southern battlefields. The archival evidence indicates that letters served multiple purposes. They were practical communications, emotional reassurances, and historical records. Their survival depended on both chance and procedural diligence. Officers sometimes copied the letters, filing them in official ledgers, or forwarded them to dead letter offices. Families carefully stored any letters they received late, often labeling them as the last words of the deceased. The combination of these factors created a bridge through time. Letters written in the field eventually reached families or archives, preserving the lived experience of the soldiers and the emotional weight of absence. In some notable cases, letters were discovered decades after the Civil War. Construction crews or family estate organizers uncovered correspondence in trunks, boxes, and desk drawers. Conservation specialists noted the remarkable preservation of ink and paper, in some instances allowing researchers to authenticate handwriting dates and unit information. These letters, sometimes arriving 50 or 60 years after they were written, provided not only closure for families, but also critical evidence for historians documenting military operations, troop movements, and personal experiences during the war. Thus, the motif established in earlier parts of the story, the letter that never reached home, extends across the entire conflict. It connects soldiers from multiple units, states, and campaigns. It demonstrates the persistence of personal communication, despite the chaos of battle, the destruction of infrastructure, and the mortality of the senders. The letters themselves form a chain linking the battlefield to homes, archives, and descendants, bridging not only distance, but time. Through careful cataloging, archival research, and family preservation, historians have been able to reconstruct patterns of correspondence, noting the delays, misdeliveries, and eventual arrivals. These patterns form a factual bridge showing that, while war disrupted communication, it could not completely erase the intent or sentiment of those writing. Each letter that survived serves as both a historical record and a testament to the enduring human desire to reach loved ones, even under impossible circumstances. In conclusion, the Civil War created a vast network of letters, many of which were delayed, misdirected, or held until after the death of their authors. Families received some decades later what the soldiers had written in the heat of battle. This pattern, fully documented, provides the factual bridge between the immediate battlefield experience and the long-term historical record. The letters themselves do not move on their own. They were preserved, passed along, and discovered. Yet through these factual circumstances, the same motif emerges as seen in folklore, a letter written in the past, continuing to connect people across time, bridging war absence and the enduring need for human connection. Decades after the Civil War had ended, boxes of correspondence continued to resurface across the country, often by accident. In Massachusetts, the Ballou letters had long been preserved in the family home, but it was not until 1933 that they were formally donated to the Rhode Island Historical Society. When archivists examined the collection, they were struck by the clarity of the ink, the legibility of the cursive, and the consistent care in which each envelope had been folded. These letters, written by Major Sullivan Ballou days before the Battle of Bull Run, had been intended to reach his wife. They arrived after his death, and in doing so became both personal relics and historical documents. The vividness of the text, including passages describing daily routines and expressions of love, transported readers back into the immediacy of 1861, bridging the gap between battlefield and home. Further south in Georgia, letters from Andersonville Prison continued to provide insight into the human experience of captivity. In the 1920s, descendants of prisoners found boxes of correspondence hidden beneath floorboards of family homes or in trunks long forgotten. One box contained letters written in pencil on scraps of paper detailing daily life within the camp. Prisoners described the scarcity of food, the heat of the summer months, and the constant threat of disease. Families received these letters decades after they were written, sometimes with the sender long deceased. Although the documents were factual and verifiable, their delayed delivery gave them an emotional resonance far greater than if they had arrived on time. They were tangible proof of survival remembrance and intent, connecting the living to the departed through paper and ink. In Virginia, archivists working on collections of Cold Harbor letters noted a recurring phrase, "If the frost breaks before I do." This wording appeared in multiple letters written independently by different soldiers facing the same military orders and the same deadly charge. These letters, preserved in the National Archives and later microfilmed, highlight a shared experience across units. Each letter carried a personal message that, due to the chaos of battle, would arrive late or not at all. Yet even decades later, the letters retained their meaning. Scholars examining these documents emphasize that the combination of physical preservation, meticulous storage, and archival cataloging allowed historians and families to access the intentions, thoughts, and emotions of men long dead. The Federal Writers Project interviews in the 1930s corroborate this pattern. Respondents recounted how letters intended for family members arrived after the writer had passed away, sometimes years later. They described the care with which the letters had been preserved, the impact on family members upon reading them, and the context of the times in which they had been written. One woman recalled receiving her father's letter 5 years after his death. In it, he instructed her on daily tasks and conveyed reassurance for her well-being. The delayed receipt did not diminish its value. Rather, it enhanced its significance, making the letter both a historical document and a personal connection to the past. Beyond individual letters, entire collections demonstrate this delayed impact. In Richmond, Virginia, construction crews in the late 20th century uncovered boxes of correspondence in foundations and attics. Letters written by soldiers to their families or commanding officers were folded sealed and sometimes addressed vaguely, without sufficient information to guarantee delivery. Nevertheless, when archivists examined the documents, they were able to authenticate them based on handwriting paper and ink composition. These letters, having survived decades of environmental exposure, provided critical insight into daily life during the war, the structure of military correspondence, and the personal intentions of soldiers. Even within the Dead Letter Office of the United States, Post Office Department, preserved ledgers and records illustrate how letters that could not be delivered were processed, copied, or stored for eventual distribution. Some letters were returned to the sender if possible, while others were archived. The preservation of these letters allowed later historians and families to reconstruct a more complete picture of Civil War communication, mortality, and social networks. Each recovered letter serves as a factual testament to the ongoing bridge between battlefield and home, between intent and fulfillment, and between life and death. The recurring motif is clear: letters written in the field, often intended for immediate family, survived despite delayed delivery, lost destinations, or the death of the writer. Examples from Rhode Island, Virginia, and Georgia all demonstrate this. Families, when finally receiving these letters, often experienced closure, reflection, or renewed understanding of their relatives' experiences. The letters remained legible, the handwriting unchanged, the content intact. They form a continuous thread linking the personal with the historical, giving modern readers insight into the human side of war. In some instances, letters were discovered more than 50 years after being written. Estate sales, construction, and archival cataloging revealed documents that had been tucked away, hidden, or misplaced. For example, in 1999, letters found during excavation near Richmond contained detailed instructions and personal notes written in 1864. The material properties of the paper and ink, as well as corroborating archival data, verified the authenticity of these letters. The individuals who wrote them were no longer alive, yet their words carried across decades, connecting past and present. The factual record of these letters culminates in the realization that while war disrupted communication, and life itself, it could not entirely erase intent. Soldiers wrote with the understanding that their words might not reach the recipient. Families preserved them as best they could. Archivists maintained them through cataloging, copying, and conservation. Through these processes, the letters continued to convey emotion, instruction, and memory, fulfilling their purpose, albeit belatedly. The climax of this factual narrative is not an invention or dramatization, but in the enduring reality letters written under duress, amid violence and uncertainty, survived to tell the story of individuals within a historical moment. The letters' delayed arrival did not diminish their meaning. Rather, it amplified their significance, showing the extraordinary persistence of human communication and the tangible survival of emotion, intention, and connection across time. By the time these letters reached their recipients, sometimes decades later, they carried the weight of history, the echo of battlefields, and the personal imprint of those who wrote them. The letters demonstrate empirically the continuity of personal experience and memory, linking past and present soldier and family, war and post-war society. They are enduring proof that despite all obstacles, human intention persists, recorded in ink and preserved in paper, capable of bridging decades, distance, and mortality. Even today, letters from the Civil War continue to be discovered, digitized, and preserved. Each one provides insight into the physical and emotional realities of the era. Their existence is a factual bridge confirming what we know from battle reports, census records, and other archival materials soldiers wrote with purpose, families preserved with care, and through the medium of letters, human experience has endured beyond the immediate reach of war. These letters, factual in origin and preservation, mark the climax of the story, despite delayed delivery loss and the passage of time they survived. They offer a window into history, revealing the lived experiences of soldiers and families alike. And in their survival lies the factual miracle of communication, proving that even under extreme circumstances, human intent, emotion, and connection can persist, forming an unbroken chain across generations. The letters that never reached their destinations do more than document the Civil War. They preserve the intentions, fears, and hopes of those who wrote them. From Rhode Island to Virginia, from Andersonville to Cold Harbor, these letters provide a tangible connection to lives that were interrupted, homes that waited, and families who endured long after the guns fell silent. Each letter, whether folded in a trunk, discovered in a floorboard, or stored in an archive, tells the story of human persistence. They are evidence of the desire to connect, to communicate, and to leave a mark even when the outcome is uncertain. While some letters arrived decades late, and others were never delivered at all, their survival allows us to witness history from the perspective of those who lived it. We see the anxiety of soldiers preparing for battle, the careful attention to detail in their writing, and the love that guided each phrase toward home. The letters, factual in origin, bridge the gap between the immediate horrors of war and the enduring memory of those affected. They remind us that history is not only about dates and battles, but also about the intimate experiences of individuals trying to preserve their connections across distance and time. As we reflect on these documents, it becomes clear that their significance extends beyond the pages themselves. They connect generations, giving voice to the absent, and provide context for the lived experiences that shaped a nation. Each recovered letter confirms a pattern. Despite death, chaos, and dislocation, human intention endures. The letters are factual artifacts, yet their emotional impact is timeless. They are proof that the simplest act, a man writing to his family, can survive decades and speak to us today. If you found this story compelling and want to uncover more hidden histories of the Civil War and beyond, make sure to subscribe to Classified History, hit the notification bell to stay updated, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which letter resonated most with you. By exploring these letters together, we preserve the voices of history and the experiences of those who lived it.